Today's material is a passionately delivered commentary transcript defending Erika Kirk's leadership at Turning Point USA against protests and accusations orchestrated by Candace Owens. And, while the passion driving this piece is super undeniable, I think we need to dive right into fortifying the mechanics of the argument, starting with the vocabulary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the excessive use of ad hominem attack and derogatory nicknames actively undermines the speaker's gravitas and, the severity of the real-world events being described.
Right.
I mean, looking at the source material, it frequently relies on these highly emotive, insult-driven monikers to refer to the subject. Throughout the whole text, we see repeated references to things like baby Bizaboo.
Oh, yeah, and scamus loins.
Exactly. Scamus loins and Candace Kremlin Hoyne. And it's just...
The immediate hurdle is that leaning into these really colorful insults fundamentally cheapens the intellectual rigor of the overarching argument. I mean, it introduces this weird schoolyard tone into an otherwise super grave discussion. Like, we are talking about the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk.
Right, exactly.
The disruption of a memorial-tinged event and the future of a massive organization. These are high-stakes, literal life-or-death realities. So framing them with pun-based nicknames creates this massive cognitive dissonance for the reader.
Yeah, and we also have to remember the supplementary source guidelines regarding the legacy of this individual. There is a very specific requirement for writers to use her actual name.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Yeah, so consider the psychology of a neutral reader, right? Someone encountering this text for the first time. The author is clearly trying to signal the malicious intent of the opposition.
Sure.
But using a term like scamus loins operates a lot like putting a ridiculously loud siren on a sports car. It definitely gets a reaction from the people who are already standing around cheering for you.
Right. Your own echo chamber.
Exactly. But it makes everyone else in the neighborhood immediately roll up their windows. It signals tribalism rather than objective analysis. When an unaligned reader hits a derogatory pun like that, their intellectual defenses just go right up.
Yeah, they subconsciously categorize the speaker as an internet combatant rather than a credible authority.
Precisely.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second. Is there a risk that stripping away these colorful nicknames removes the piece's unique, fiery voice?
How do you mean?
Well, the core audience for this kind of political commentary usually tunes in specifically for that rhetorical heat, They want to see the opposition dragged. So if we sanitize the language too much, do we alienate the base who expects that performative outrage?
Well, I think it really comes down to understanding the mechanics of what actually generates heat in a piece of writing. There's a profound difference between the superficial heat of an insult and the inescapable fire of a devastating fact.
Okay, I like that distinction.
Yeah, true rhetorical fire comes from undeniable, methodical deconstruction, not from calling someone a cartoonish name. Actually, giving an opponent a cartoonish nickname gives them a rhetorical escape hatch.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because it allows them to dismiss the author as unserious or just emotional.
Exactly, or unprofessional. But if the author elevates the rhetoric by using the subject's actual name, they strip away that escape hatch completely. They let the objective severity of the alleged actions deliver the punch.
So think about how much harder the argument hits if the author simply drops scamus loins and writes Candace Owens.
Right.
Like, instead of deploying a phrase like hoeing for the Kremlin, the author could state factually that her geopolitical alignments and post-tragedy actions run in direct opposition to the organization's stated Western values.
Which sounds so much better. By anchoring the critique in concrete behavior rather than name-calling, the speaker immediately projects this formidable journalistic authority. You stop looking like someone just venting on a message board.
And start looking like a prosecuting attorney laying out an undeniable indictment.
Yes, exactly. When you look the opposition in the eye, use their legal name, and methodically list the ways their actions betray their stated principles during a time of profound grief, that creates a corner they cannot back out of.
It's inescapable. And, once that credible, authoritative tone is established, it sets a very specific expectation for the reader. A serious tone promises a focused, urgent narrative, and then the narrative structure has to maintain a tight grip on the audience's attention to fulfill that promise, which kind of brings us to the structure, right?
Yeah, the structure. And the big issue here is that frequent narrative tangents into the speaker's personal logistics and unrelated pop culture grievances totally disrupt the emotional momentum of the core thesis.
It really does. Because the material is ostensibly building this case, contrasting builders and destroyers, right?
Right.
Positioning Erika Kirk as the builder and the protesters as the destroyers.
Exact. But the momentum just falls apart completely when the narrative meanders away from this primary conflict. The piece takes these severe, really prolonged detours to explain the speaker's daily administrative routine.
Oh man, yeah. We get a massive, lengthy breakdown of logging onto X, editing short-form content.
Doing morning reading in reverse order.
Yes, finishing admin work, and even helping a partner edit her video. It's just so out of place.
And it's not even just the daily logistics, right? The text digresses into entirely unrelated asides about Boy George, Pride Month, and this oddly specific breakdown of the facial mechanics of a demon smile.
The demon smile part was definitely a choice.
Yeah, it's an issue of narrative velocity. When you're constructing a commentary piece around a high-stakes conflict, in this case the siege of a memorial event, the audience allocates their attention based on what you tell them is important.
Right.
By dedicating significant word count to logging into a website or outlining an upload schedule, the author is inadvertently telling the audience that the stakes are actually quite low. It dilutes the urgency.
You know, listening to those personal tangents feels a bit like a prosecuting attorney pausing a dramatic, highly emotional closing argument to explain to the jury what they had for breakfast that morning.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
And then, detailing how long it took to toast the bagel. It completely shatters the tension in the room.
Totally.
When you have a captive audience listening to a high-stakes story about an infiltrated event, you want to keep them on the edge of their seats. Every time the text pivots to discussing Twitter algorithms or video editing, it literally gives the audience permission to mentally check out.
Yeah. So if I were editing this piece, I would advise the author to aggressively streamline the narrative. Just prune any personal anecdotes or secondary grievances that do not directly service that central thematic contrast of builders versus destroyers.
Right, be ruthless with it. For instance, the author should completely remove that 45-second block detailing the morning reading and video editing routine.
It adds zero argumentative weight. None.
Exactly. And the Boy George tangent should be cut entirely too. Instead, the structural lens needs to be pinned exclusively on the 3 specific disruptions that occurred at the event.
Because the narrative already has a really natural, compelling triad built into it.
It does. You have the claim of the AI-generated succession video, the infiltration of the PDF protector heckler inside the room, and the outside protesters mocking the tragedy.
The triad is the structural spine of the piece. When you isolate those 3 events and string them together without interruption, they represent a complete multi-front siege.
Yeah, you have a digital attack with the AI claims, an internal breach with the heckler, and a physical blockade with the outside protesters.
It's a brilliant escalating narrative structure. It's terrifying, it's urgent, and it perfectly illustrates the destroyer theme. But the audience entirely loses sight of that escalating siege when they're suddenly forced to read about the speaker's daily vlog logistics right in the middle of it.
From this casual stream of consciousness update into a gripping historical record of that specific night.
And that tension is the greatest asset this material possesses. I mean, the speaker was essentially a witness to a highly orchestrated disruption. Honoring that tension requires a relentless focus on the events themselves.
Definitely. And, as that physical and digital siege is cleanly laid out for the audience, the logical framework analyzing those events has to be just as tight.
Right.
Because it's one thing to show the audience what happened. It's another to explain why it matters in a way that is completely bulletproof against outside skepticism.
Which brings us to the logic of the argument. Relying heavily on spiritual hyperbole as a substitute for logical deconstruction leaves the core argument really vulnerable to outside dismissal.
Yeah, throughout the text, the speaker repeatedly labels the opposition's actions strictly as demonic, or the work of principalities, or unspoiledly just plain stupid.
Right, and while this language clearly aligns with the piece's Judeo-Christian framing, and obviously the worldview of its core audience, using these terms as the sole explanatory mechanism acts as a thought-terminating cliché.
It effectively short-circuits the analytical process. By just defaulting to saying they are demonic, the author completely bypasses the opportunity to methodically expose the ideological hypocrisy of the attacker's actual arguments.
Exactly. It tells the sympathetic reader that the protesters are bad, sure, but it completely fails to dismantle the protesters' logic for anyone who doesn't already share the author's exact theological presuppositions.
And a thought-terminating cliché is incredibly dangerous in persuasive writing, because it literally stops the conversation.
It does. I mean, if the author's goal is merely to preach to the choir, simply calling the opposition demons might suffice.
Sure.
But if the goal is to write a piece of enduring criticism that thoroughly discredits the opposition, you cannot rely on supernatural labels to do the heavy lifting of logical argumentation. A skeptic reading the piece will hit the word demonic and immediately write off the rest of the analysis as purely religious opinion rather than objective critique.
So the author really needs to anchor the spiritual warfare angle in concrete behavioral contradictions. They have to demonstrate exactly how the opposition violates their own stated values.
Right, effectively showing rather than just telling the audience why the opposition is morally bankrupt.
Yeah, think about the mechanics of a logical trap. You don't defeat an opponent solely by throwing your worldview at them. You defeat them by using their own worldview against them.
Yes.
If you can prove that they are failing to live up to the very standards they are aggressively chanting about, you destroy their credibility entirely.
And the crazy thing is, the text actually has the perfect vehicle to execute this shift already embedded within it.
Oh, the part with Dana?
Exactly. The transcript mentions this specific, highly charged moment where a speaker named Dana gets on stage and reads scripture regarding the persecution of widows and the fatherless.
Yes.
The author should lean much heavier into that specific moment. Instead of broadly declaring the protesters outside to be demons, they should meticulously contrast their use of the Christ is King slogan with their literal actions in that exact moment.
Because they are actively harassing a grieving widow, Erika, and attempting to tear down a women's empowerment event.
Right. Showing the hypocrisy using theological logic is devastating. The author can break down how claiming a moral high ground while terrorizing a recently bereaved woman is a direct violation of the precise text the protesters claim to champion.
Wow, yeah. When you point out that they are chanting Christ is King while simultaneously violating the biblical commands in Isaiah to plead the case of the widow, you trap them in a logical vice.
Exactly. You aren't just calling them names. You are providing textual proof that their actions render their religious slogans entirely fraudulent.
And the seed of this brilliant logical takedown is already planted in the text. The author briefly touches on this exact logic when mentioning the virtue signaling, right misusing the Christ is King phrase.
Right. So they get it.
Yeah, the author clearly understands the mechanics of this hypocrisy. They just haven't cultivated it into the focal point. It just kind of remains a passing aside before returning to the broader hyperbolic labels.
But centering that specific scripture-based hypocrisy changes the entire complexion of the argument. It elevates the speaker from someone who is just angry at the protesters into someone who is intellectually dismantling them from the inside out.
It totally does.
It turns the transcript from a defensive reaction into an offensive, undeniable critique of the opposition's core integrity.
And it forces the opposition onto the defensive because they can no longer simply brush off the critique as standard political mudslinging. I mean, when you use their own texts and their own slogans to prove their actions are abusive, there's just no rhetorical escape route.
No. There isn't. But it requires a discipline of focus. Every time the author is tempted to write, "This is demonic," they need to pause and translate that feeling into an observable fact.
Right.
Instead of "this is demonic," write, "This action fundamentally contradicts their stated belief because," whatever the reason. That translation from emotion to observation is what turns a journal entry into a persuasive essay.
That's beautifully said. So just to recap, the core areas where this transcript can be significantly fortified for the author. First, elevate the authority of the piece by dropping the internet nicknames.
Yep.
Use actual names like Candace Owens and rely on the objective severity of the facts to carry the rhetorical weight.
Absolutely.
Second, maintain the narrative momentum of the physical and digital siege by aggressively cutting the personal logistics in tangent. Keep the audience locked in the room during those 3 disruptions.
No breakfast routines?
Right, no breakfast routines. And third, ground the spiritual critique not in broad declarations of demonic activity, but in the concrete, logical exposure of the opposition's hypocrisy regarding their treatment of a grieving widow.
I think that's the perfect roadmap. The foundational material here is incredibly strong. It possesses a tremendous amount of heart, a clear moral compass, and a genuinely compelling story of resilience at its center.
It really does.
By making these targeted adjustments, swapping out the schoolyard insults for unassailable facts, clearing the narrative brush to reveal the core tension, and tightening the logical trap around the opposition's theology. This work will absolutely transform into an intellectually undeniable piece of commentary.
I couldn't agree more. We highly encourage the listener to implement these structural and tonal adjustments and submit the revised work back to us for another critique. We would love to see how this piece evolves.